everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jie Huang. I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time discussing the EB-5 immigration by investment option, also known as the millionaire green card. We will talk about the EB-5 requirements and answer the top questions that come up in connection with EB-5 petitions. So a few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm focused on immigration options for investors and entrepreneurs. We do assist individuals pursuing various types of visas, including family-based, employment-based, including EB-5 investor immigration options. We regularly do process a high number of them. We will be continuing these webinar series, and we will be doing at least 2 webinars a month on different immigration law topics. So please follow us and join any further webinars that we may offer in the future. At the end of this webinar, we will be sending out a few things to all participants. First, we will be sending out a PowerPoint that has all the information that will be covered in this webinar. We will also be sending you an EB-5 immigration guide, a comprehensive guide you can use as a reference. We will also send you a link to where you can sign up for additional upcoming webinars in the future on different immigration law topics, and also a link to this webinar as it will be recorded. This webinar will also be available on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel as we do regularly upload immigration law related videos. And finally, we will also be including a link that you can follow to set up a consultation with us should you wish to discuss your case further. So today, we are lucky to have Ian Scott, founder and president of the firm, who has a wealth of EB-5 experience, who will be answering these commonly found questions regarding the EB-5. And finally, for any questions you may have, please feel free to add them to the chat box or the Q&A function, and we will try and get to all questions. So without further delay, let us start with the first question. Ian, so the EB-5 program has gone through some changes over the past year. Could you describe some of these changes?
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to be here, GA. And yeah, so the EB-5 program, it has changed quite a bit over the last year in particular, and really maybe the last year and a half or 2 years. And there are a few different things that were going on with the EB-5 program. And we're kind of trying to break it down in terms of the different types of EB-5s and some of the changes in the law. So what had happened almost 2 years ago was that there was a controversy with respect to, it's a lot of history, right? But controversy with respect to how the head of the immigration unit of the government was appointed. And as a result of that controversy, there was additional controversy with respect to changes that the last administration made to the EB-5 program. And then there was a lawsuit, and with that lawsuit, the individuals alleged that because that person that was appointed wasn't lawfully appointed, that those changes were null and void. And so the changes, there were a number of changes, but one of the biggest changes had to do with the increase in the investment amount, the amount that was required to apply for an EB-5. So then that was one thing that was going on. And then there was another thing that was going on, is that there's kind of 2 elements of EB-5, and one element in that, that element takes up probably 90 or 95% of the applications. It's where someone is investing in EB-5 through a regional center. That program is something that has to be reauthorized by Congress every once, well, just for the purposes of this discussion, every once in a while. Mm-hmm. Now, what had happened on June 30th of 2021, the regional center program was set to expire. And normally, every time in the past, it had been reauthorized. But unfortunately, this time it didn't get reauthorized. And then it took, it wasn't a month or 2 months or 3 months. It took several months for it to be reauthorized again. And it wasn't until March of 2022 that it was actually reauthorized. So all of those things were kind of going on in the background. Now, because of that, over the last couple of years, there's been kind of changes that have occurred with respect to what, how much is the investment amount. There was a pause in the regional center program so that people that had applications pending, they weren't being adjudicated and people couldn't file new EB-5 applications. So then, thankfully, in March of 2022, Congress passed, we'll call it a Reform Act for EB-5, where they implemented a number of different changes. So one was they reauthorized the regional center program. Two was that they set the kind of new, I'll call it new and improved investment amount. And then they made a number of other changes. So some of the changes had to do with the amounts that what could be considered an investment. They also introduced a change which allowed people to file I-485 petitions at the same time that the primary petition was filed. So a number of different changes that were implemented in March of 2022. So now, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of the changes, but there were a number of them. But now the program is settled a little bit in that there's clarity with respect to how much you have to invest. There's clarity with respect to the rules, and that's been the case since March of 2022.
Wow, that's a lot. Okay, then maybe we can dial back and talk about some of the key requirements then. So now, with respect to how the law is currently, then what are the key requirements to obtain an EB-5?
So yeah, and so one, the kind of two key requirements, but then maybe some sub requirements. So the first requirement is that you have to invest money. So you're either going to invest $800,000 or $1,050,000. Now, the determination of whether you can invest the lower amount or the higher amount, or have to invest the higher amount, really depends on where the business is located. So if the business is located in a rural area, so the government or the local jurisdiction would determine whether the area was rural based on population, like low population, or if the area was located in an area where the unemployment rate was 1.5 times the national average. So the national average right now, the unemployment rate, I think it's 3.5%. So any area, that would be based on looking at a census tract, and there's kind of a couple different ways to do this, but generally speaking, looking at a census tract, and the government would indicate this particular census tract has an unemployment rate of X, Y, or Z, and then if it was 1.5 times the national average, then you would be able to invest the lower investment amount. So that's kind of the investment amount is kind of one of the big or key criteria. The second is job creation. So to get a green card, you have to invest either the 800,000 or the 1,050,000, but also the entity has to create 10 full-time jobs. So it's the EB-5 program is very entity specific. So there is when you're investing the money, you're investing in what's called a new commercial enterprise. That in the statute they say new commercial enterprise, but really it's any enterprise that was founded after 1990. There's an exact month and day, but in 1990. So many enterprises can work. It can be an enterprise that has existed for quite some time, and then you invest in, or it could be an enterprise that you start now and invest in. So definitely lots of different options with respect to that. Then there are definitely some kind of sub requirements as well, but I think that really the crux of the EB-5 program is the investment and job creation.
Great. Yeah. So two things to remember: investment and job creation, not one or the other. All right. So then what would be the difference between a regional center EB-5 investment and what we call a direct EB-5 investment? And what will be some of the characteristics of typical investor profile for each?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said earlier, one of the majority, overwhelming majority, probably over 90% of the applicants actually apply for the EB-5 program through what's called a regional center. And I didn't explain it then, so I'm glad you asked the question now. And what a regional center is really and this really lends itself to an investor that really is interested in a much more passive investment, that wants to give someone else their money and then that other person or entity is going to be in charge of the job creation, creating the 10 full-time jobs. But a good example would be, let's say that Hilton was building a hotel chain and in New York City or in another place, and then they wanted to raise some capital to do that, and they said, well, I want to use the EB-5 program to do that. And then let's say that they were developing the hotel in the area where the unemployment rate was 1.5 times the national average. Then they would try and attract a number of different investors to all invest, like, let's say 60 investors to all invest $800,000. And then they would create the jobs on their behalf. So that's in essence what a regional center is. And one of the benefits of a regional center is that when you're looking at the job creation can be based on direct jobs, so jobs that, in this case, that the hotel hires people, but then also the job creation can be based on indirect jobs. And what that means is that you get an economist to write a report and say, well, there's a hotel here, and because there's a hotel here, there's going to be a laundromat beside, and there's going to be a mall, and there's going to be all these other things. And so the economist writes a report saying that there are a bunch of indirect jobs that are going to be created. And often when you're looking at regional centers, a big part of the job creation is based on these indirect jobs. And sometimes the indirect jobs are a little easier to prove because really you're looking at an economist report versus proving the direct jobs, which you have to kind of look at each individual employee, make sure that they're a US citizen or a green card holder, and make sure that the job is full-time. So that's the typical profile of a regional center investor. Now, someone who is now the other small percentage of EB-5 cases that are done are people who want to have much more control over their money and their investment. Because the other thing I forgot to mention about regional centers is that you're investing in this project, but there is no return, right? So the project documents might have a very small return, like a fraction of a percent. But when you invest in these projects, you actually have to pay a $30,000 to $60,000 or $70,000 administration fee. So the actual return is negative, right? So the people who are investing in these projects really are doing it just to get the green card, not because it's a good investment in terms of making a lot of financial sense. But an individual who wants to do the direct investment, they might have an E2 visa already, so they might have their own company, or they just want to actually start their own company and they want to control the money themselves. And the requirements are the same in the sense of they still have to invest either the $800,000 or the $1,050,000. And in this case, though, they're going to be responsible for the actual job creation. So they're, and then I think the other kind of big thing with direct investments is that when you're investing in an EB-5 regional center program, you give the money over and, you really don't have to do anything else. But if you are doing the direct investment, you do have to follow a lot of rules, because there's rules with respect to where the money can be spent, how it can be spent, kind of not paying money back to the owner in terms of bonuses or salary and things like that. So you really have to, there's a lot more work related to direct investment, but the work might be worth it because you don't have to pay the administration fee, and you are doing something for your own company. So that's kind of the breakdown of the differences between the two.
I see. That's very helpful. And just another question regarding the regional center. So are all regional center projects located in targeted employment areas?
They are. It's not that they have to be. It's just that regional centers typically are, because they want to attract many investors, and many investors are interested in projects where they where they're eligible for the lower investment amount. So in the past, because before the change to 800,000, the investment amount was 500,000, and then the difference was either 500,000 or $1 million. Right? So it was twice as much. But the other thing as well is that one of the changes that occurred in March was that in the past, it was very, very easy to get targeted employment area designation. So you had projects in Hudson Yards in Manhattan, in the financial district in Manhattan, that were designated as TEAs, targeted employment areas. And it's because the methodology for calculating it was very conducive to almost gaming the system, where you could, as long as the census tracts were adjacent, you could string them up. So to get, Hudson Yards, let's say the richest areas in Manhattan, you could just kind of string them up through Washington Heights and the Bronx. And as long as you keep on adjacent, then, you keep on adding up and adding up and adding up. And then you could come to the 1.5 times the national average. But that was one of the changes that they made in March. So they made it much, much harder to do that. So our targeted employment areas now often are true targeted employment areas, but
Right.
but usually regional centers, the targeted employment areas are I don't think I've seen a regional center that has an investment amount of $1,050,000.
Makes sense. Okay, so the next question would be then with regards to when you're filing and applying for EB-5 designation, which petitions do we need to file?
Absolutely. So the petitions that would be filed is one. The first petition is the objective petition, which shows that you've made the investment and that you have the ability to create the full-time job. So the petition is going to be an I-526 petition or an I-526E petition if you're filing a regional center, but they're very similar in terms of the questions that they ask. It's just the differences in E after the number of one of them. So that's what you're going to file as the initial petition. Now, depending on whether you're in the United States or outside of the United States, if you're outside of the United States, then after that petition has been approved, you're going to be doing consular processing. But if you're in the United States, then you do have the option of filing an I-485 petition, which is an adjustment of status petition. And this is another one of this is probably the single biggest, greatest change related to March when they implemented the new rules, was that you can now file the I-526 petition and the I-485 petition concurrently. And that gives people who are in the United States an enormous amount of benefit because they're able to stay here, live here, and actually apply for work and travel authorization here. And this is especially important because the I-526 petitions are taking upwards of 4 years to be adjudicated. So it's so this was a significant change, because before you had to wait till the I-526 petition was approved before you were given any benefit. Now, the one caveat is that for the I-485 petition, you had to wait for the I-526 was approved before you were given any significant benefit. The one caveat is that the I-485, you're allowed to file that if your visa category is current. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but there are a few countries, I think two,
Yep.
China and India, where the visa categories right now are not current. And again, this is starting to get complicated, but even China and India now, if you're applying through, if you're applying either through a regional center or direct investment where you're in a targeted employment area, that was another big change in March, where they did a carve out. And for new applications, if you're applying in a targeted employment area, then those applications would actually be current right now. So even though there are many people from China and India right now waiting in a queue, we have some clients that have been waiting for years because their visa category is not current. But those same clients, if they withdrew their application and applied today, their category would be current. Now, again, though, that doesn't speed up the processing of the I-526 petition, but it does give someone who, for example, is in the United States, the ability to file the I-485 petition.
Yeah, very important tip to know. So you did touch on this a little bit, but yeah, so exactly how long are the petitions taking to be adjudicated?
Crazy timing, like 4 years, sometimes even longer. We have we have clients right now that have that are either close to the 4-year mark or over the 4-year mark. So and that's the I-526 petition. Oh, and I stopped at the I-485 petition, and there's one other petition that has to be filed after you have the green card for 2 years. You have to file another petition, which is called an I-829 petition, which is a removal of conditions petition. And that really basically is showing the government that you actually have created the 10 full-time jobs. Now, in terms of, so first petition 4 years, second petition maybe a year and a half. Now that they're being filed concurrently, maybe faster. It's hard to say because it's still pretty new. And then the I-829 petition, that is taking about 4 or 5 years to be approved as well. Now, mind you, when you when you're waiting for the I-829 to be approved, you do have the green card benefit still. So but it's just you don't actually have the unconditional green card at that time. So it's
Right. And so the I-829, the purpose of that is to really see if you have created the 10 jobs that is required.
exactly, because you have 2 years, 2 to 2.5 years after your I-526 has been approved to create the 10 full-time jobs. So that's him.
Right. And for the I-829 part of the removal of conditions, like how long has that been taking?
Yeah, that's 4 or 5 years, maybe even longer. We have a client that has been waiting over 3 years, and we are now, the client has opted to do something about it, but we have a client that's waited over 3 years, and that's a client that's, because it's getting worse and worse. And this is a client that I almost say legacy. This is a client that had their I-526 approved when they were taking less than a year. So this is a client who has been and this, it's a client who the I-829 presumably would be easy to adjudicate because it is a regional center, and the regional center provides pretty extensive documents related to job creation, right? So it's just that the backlog is such, like, they are complicated petitions, but the backlog is such that it's just that they haven't gotten to these petitions yet.
Wow. So in total, it could really take, the whole process could take close to a decade then.
Exactly.
In some cases.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. Very important to know that. Okay. So the next question I have for you is then, right. So after you file either the after you file the I-526 then, so do you automatically have the ability to stay in the US while it is pending?
So yeah, it's a great question, and so no, the I-526 has never and will never give you confer any benefit to stay in the United States. So you have to, in order to be able to stay in the United States, you may have another visa, E2 or some other underlying visa that gives you the ability to stay in the US, but to stay in the US, the I-526 does not give you that ability. In order to have, if the only thing it can give you the ability to do is file the I-485,
Right.
which could give you the ability to stay in the US.
Right. Okay, so maybe then we can move to some of the details of what it takes to apply for the EB-5. So could you describe the steps you would take when you are investing in a regional center?
Absolutely. So the first step, I think, is finding the right regional center. So this is something that your immigration attorney can't help you with. It's something that, it is an investment just like any other investment. So if you go to search the internet for regional centers, we think that it's always a good idea to choose a regional center that's been around for a long time, that's been tested, has many approvals, has many I-526 approvals, I-829 approvals, has returned the money to people, to many people. So there are many regional centers that have been around from day one almost. The USCIS website has a list of all of the regional centers. There are hundreds of them, maybe 800 or more. Certainly, if a regional center hasn't been around for at least a couple of years, and they're not going to have, or several years, now they're not going to have really any approvals to kind of point to. So again, but choosing a regional center is key first. Then you would also, before you transferred any money, you would really make sure that your source of funds is all in order. So source of funds, it's one of those kind of side requirements. I said that EB-5 has the two main requirements, but source of funds is a subset of the investment requirement, and the government does require that the investment comes from a legitimate source. And that can be very complicated. So E2 has a similar requirement that the investment comes from a similar source. But when you're looking at EB-5, you're taking the E2 requirements and then maybe multiplying them by 1,000 or 1,000,000 in terms of what the government is looking for with respect to proving the source of funds. EB-5 petitions actually, surprisingly, and just the other day, I saw a statistic on this, they actually have relatively high denial rates. Probably, I think this last stat that I looked at for last quarter, almost 50% of EB-5 petitions are denied. Now, if they're denied, and the majority are regional centers, the denials have to do with source of funds, right? So because the regional center piece usually isn't an issue. It's just when you're applying to a regional center that already has approvals, then all that your petition is undergoing is the source of funds analysis.
Right.
And they can be quite particular. And we've gotten some really nasty RFEs on source of funds. But, so make sure your source of funds are in order before you transfer the money. It's important to engage an immigration lawyer before you move anything. We had a client that that engaged us after they transferred their money. It was a client from China. So when you transfer money from China, you have to transfer to 10 friends and family. It's all legal. 50,000. It was at that time it was 500,000, $50,000 to 10 friends and family. Then they have to transfer the money over, and all legal, but that's the way it has to be done. And so this client did that before they ever contacted us. But then when we got to the source of funds, we realized we couldn't use any of the money. It wouldn't. So they had to transfer another 500,000. And they were subsequently approved without even an RFE. And it was a unbelievably complicated source of funds, thousands of pages of documents. But they're currently in the United States on an F or something. I say that because they're one of those people who are in that long line that and can't file the I-485, so they're waiting for their visa category to become current, but they're here on another status. So then once you have gotten the source of funds sorted out, you transfer the money over to the regional center, and then that's when we file start filing the petitions.
That definitely seems like one reason why you definitely want to talk to a lawyer before actually taking significant steps towards the investment.
Exactly. Definitely.
Right. So how does a client then usually do this research of finding a regional center? Because I believe that is a very important element on this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is going to be internet based. A lot of the larger regional centers have quite extensive websites where they post their results and things like that. So a lot of it is going to be, you could start with the USCIS website and then, speak with the regional center, ask them how long they've been around. Don't take anything for granted. You can always do due diligence and go back and look and see when they're incorporated and things like that.
Right.
You could hire an investment advisor, because they'd be able to advise you on the investment aspects of the EB-5 as well. So.
Right. So kind of like any other investment decision, you would do the due diligence on your end and make sure that it is a sound investment opportunity before going forward. So what would you say the biggest challenge then is involved in an EB-5 case through a regional center? Would it be the source of funds, as you mentioned, or is there another aspect?
Yeah, it is. It is a source of funds. That's the biggest issue, is a source of funds. Yeah, and it really is. It really is. With many clients, we kind of say to them, when they start the process, it's kind of like don't take this for granted, and it's going to be a very intrusive process. But that's really what the biggest issue is.
And could you perhaps give an example of what kinds of documentation the government would be asking us to submit with regards to the source of funds?
Yeah, absolutely. So if, depending on what it's for, so let's go through a couple of examples. One, let's say that it just comes from savings from work. Then we would include your tax returns for the last several years, but then we would also include bank statements showing an accumulation of the funds. So the bank statement should have to show money going into the account and funds being accumulated over time. So that would be a simple one, but very rarely do we have simple source of funds. So if you sold a property, for example, you'd have to provide obviously the documentation related to the property, but then you'd actually have to provide documentation of where you got the money to buy the property. So it can go back and back and back, and they don't care how long ago it was. If you inherited the money from somebody and that person's no longer with us, then they still don't care, right? You still would have to provide documentation related to if that person obtained the money through savings, you'd have to provide information related to their tax returns, et cetera. So it is quite extensive, depending on what the actual source of funds, is.
And we have a question here from the Q&A box. Can you receive funds as a gift or a loan from someone?
Yeah, absolutely. So you definitely can. If you receive funds as a gift or a loan, you have to show where that person got the money from. If the money's coming from a bank, of course, that's not going to be an issue. But if the money's coming from an individual or a smaller company, then you'd have to show where they got the money from. So it would almost be as if they were the investor. If in terms of loan, the only loan that wouldn't be accepted is a loan that where the assets of the business are the security, but all other loans are fine, including unsecured loans.
Right. Okay. So then maybe let's shift gears a little bit and discuss the direct investment option for the EB-5. So could you describe the steps that someone would take when they are investing in a direct investment project for the EB-5?
Yeah, absolutely. So this one is definitely different because the person has to organize a lot more because they're going to set up a business entity because for EB-5 they're very particular about how the money is transferred as well, and the money has to come from the individual. Like E2 is not strict about where the money comes from. You can set up an entity, the money can come through an entity, the money can be transferred directly from a friend or relative. But here, the money has to come from the individual. The USCIS would deny petitions where let's say a parent was giving a gift to the child, and then the parent, instead of putting the money in the child's bank account, they sent the money directly to the regional center. And then USCIS would deny the petition, saying that the child never had possession and control of the funds. Ridiculous, right? Absolutely ridiculous. They still have the gift letter, they have everything, but they denied petitions about this. So regional centers are very explicit, the good ones will say, do not have, the money has to come from the investor. So it takes a little bit more organizing there. So then you'd set up the entity, the money would go into the entity, and then you would spend it or have contractual commitments for it, because the money can't just sit in a bank account. They'll deny the case because they'll just say that the owner can just take the money out, right? So you have to have contractual commitments or spend, a good portion of the money. And then once that's done, then you can file the application. You're also going to have to develop a business plan if you have if you're doing a direct investment, because they'll approve the E2 with a credible business plan that shows that they'll approve the EB-5 with a credible business plan that shows that you plan to hire 10 full-time workers, but you do have to kind of there's a famous case, it's called Matter of Ho, where they had a 3 or 4 page business plan, put $500,000 in a business bank account, and then applied for the EB-5. And there's an opinion they wrote explaining why that didn't work, right? And it wasn't the source of funds, that was no issue. It was that they said that doesn't work, like for many reasons. But yeah.
So like what I guess if there is a substantial amount that needs to be spent, then like what kind of percentage could is there a percentage that we would be looking towards, or what's the standard?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on, because the thing is, it doesn't have to be spent. It's not, not so much like E2 in the sense where we look for spend, but it has to be committed. So I think it depends on what, like, for example, if you have a lease commitment that covers the full investment, then that could be sufficient in itself, right? So let's say the lease commitment for 10 years. So I think it is a very kind of specific kind of case by case, because even if you have employees already, for example, then we can extrapolate, okay, that's a commitment that the employees, they may leave, but it's a commitment. So it really will depend. We just filed one recently where very, very low on commitments, and it'll be a test case. Sure. Because there was a filing deadline in that case, right? So the person had to file to meet a benefit. But it definitely would have been beneficial to have more commitments and more things done before. But it's still, it could work. It could still work. It just depends on which examiner you get.
Right, that makes sense. And related to kind of the technicalities of business organization, can multiple investors pool together funds in one business to get multiple EB-5 green cards?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the answer is now no. So in March of 2022, that was one of the changes, and what it is, it shows the benefit or the how strong lobby groups can be, because the lobby groups, that I imagine that this is what happened, is that the time when the regional center program was shut down, then what people were doing is they were because the time the regional center program was shut down, the direct investment program was still alive and running. So not that one doesn't have to be reauthorized. So what people were doing was they were saying, okay, well, I can't invest in regional center, so let's pool a bunch of individual investors together, and then we can do the same thing, and we don't have the administration fee.
Right.
So regional centers took issue with that, and they lobbied the government. So that was one of the changes. Now you can only get, one investor per entity. So that's, which is a change. We have direct investment EB-5s where we have, 2, 3 investors, and it would be 10 jobs per investor, but it was permitted. Whereas now it's just one investor, 10 jobs. Yeah.
Right. So the only scenario where people would be pooling money is the regional center program, and outside the regional center program, that's not permitted anymore.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
I see. So with regards to what can constitute the investment funds, can retained earnings from your business count towards your investment?
Yeah, this is another great question, and so let me just tee it up with respect to with an example. Like let's say someone has an E2, for example, and they invested 100,000 initially, and they're trucking away in their company, and the company's doing really well, and then let's say the company makes $2 million, and then they have 1.5 million left over in profit, and they that's spent the next year, and they say, well, listen, I've invested 100,000, and I've also invested the 1.5 million in retained earnings and profit, so that's 2 million. So let's go with the EB-5, and that doesn't work. So the investment has to be personal investment from outside of the company that's invested. So it could maybe work if they paid themselves, paid taxes, and then reinvest, but you'd have to track all that, and it might be more trouble than it's worth because the government's going to scrutinize it quite a bit. So
right. And are there any other items like this one that cannot be included in the investment amount?
Yeah, exactly. They are definitely much more particular than E2, for example. So for example, you have to really be careful. Let's say that you invested 800,000. I use this because that's the minimum amount, right? Let's say you invested 800,000, but then you paid yourself a salary, or you took a bonus or whatever. Then now the government's saying, well, wait a minute, you invested $800,000 and you paid yourself 50,000. So then they deny your case just for that, right? Because they don't, you can't include administrative fees in your investment. So you can't like legal fees or accounting fees and things like that. So we do have to go through and make sure that the expenditures directly relate to the business and that there are no prohibited expenditures. When you're doing E2, if someone spent something that spent money on something that wasn't really kind of a perfect expenditure, it's not going to kill your case because there's no set investment amount. The issue with EB-5, if you're only investing the minimum, the 800,000, you have to be especially particular, because even if you have $1 of expenditures that they consider disqualified, that could tank your case just because you haven't met the actual requirement of investing $800,000, right? That's right. What the issue is. If you invest more, then you could maybe spend money on different things. But but you have to be really careful if you're at the kind of threshold.
Yeah, it could be a good idea to spend a little more then.
Exactly.
To kind of hedge that risk.
Exactly.
Okay, so with regards to the other elements that would accompany the petition, could you maybe talk a little bit about the business plan that we include, and how to prepare and what function does it serve?
Yeah, absolutely. So the business plan is definitely a document that even a regional center will have a business plan, but it will apply to the entire enterprise or operation that they're undertaking. But business plan is definitely needed for a startup. If you are investing in another business where there are already employees or it's already operational, then maybe a business plan is not needed, because the employees that are there already when you invest don't count. It has to be 10 more employees. So I do take that back. You still should have a business plan in that case, because you are because the employees that are there don't count. You want to show the government what the plan is to create additional employees.
Right. So really, it is to show the government that you will be creating 10 employees once your initial petition is approved.
Exactly. And there has to be a link between the investment and the employees, right? So that's why the employees that are there already don't count. There has to be a link between the investment and the employees.
Right. So 10 new employees, in
Exactly.
addition to ones that may already been there
Be
if you
there.
are investing in an existing business.
Exactly.
And so just to expand a little bit more about the job creation aspect then, so do all of the EB-5 jobs need to be full-time?
Yeah, so they do, and think of it as that when we're looking at EB-5 jobs, we're not looking at individuals, we're looking at roles. So they have to be full-time roles. So that eliminates part-time completely, right? So, but there is a concept of job sharing. Like, so if you have, like, let's say a full-time role where someone's working 9 to 12 and then someone else is working 12 to 5, that could work, right? But we like to avoid that because the government might say it's just 2 part-time jobs, right? And
Right.
so it's a subtle distinction, but it's one that, if especially if you only have you're barely meeting the requirement, definitely having 10 full-time jobs is really what you want to do, because it's quite a documentation exercise if you have to share. And then the jobs, it's full-time US citizens or green card holders. So you really
Right.
have to check the documentation, because the government doesn't care. If someone gives you false documentation, when you go to remove the conditions, the government checks to make sure that they're all US citizens or green card holders. And whether they gave you false documentation or not, is irrelevant. We submitted an I-526 petition once, and we included information on employees just to show that they could create the jobs. And we got an RFE back, and they pointed out that some of those people were not legal. And
Incredible.
we had to say to them, well, listen, this isn't the IA-29 stage. We're just pointing this out to show that jobs can be created. So they ended up approving it, but it's a good reminder that you really have to, because those people submitted to the employer, they submitted false green card information. So you have to, the best way to do is through E-Verify if you're doing this, because E-Verify is going to check to make sure that those people actually are, US citizens or green card holders.
Well, that is a great lesson learned that the USCIS officer will actually punch in the numbers and check.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and there were 2 of them. What killed me is there
I see.
there were a couple of them where they weren't valid. So yeah.
Wow. I see. And so with regards to the timing of the job, so when do these 10 full-time jobs have to be created?
Exactly. So 2.5 years after the I-526 has been approved.
Right. So after the approval of the initial, then you need to show creation of 10 full-time jobs.
Exactly. So you do have a lot of time, especially given how long the petitions are taking to be approved.
Right. So you touched on this a little bit, but what would be the process like for buying an existing business using the EB-5 program?
Yeah, it's a great, now this is a fundamental distinction or difference between E2. In E2, they don't mind if you buy a business. You buy a restaurant, you give the seller $200,000, no problem. In EB-5, buying a business doesn't work, because buying a business in the scenario where you give the seller the money, and the seller takes the money and goes to Disneyland or buys a condo or whatever. That doesn't work. The reason is because the money isn't creating jobs. The money isn't going into the business. That's different from, for example, let's say you were investing the money in the business. You got 50% of the shares and the money went into the business. That could work, right? Because then you spend the money on creating jobs. But giving it to the seller doesn't work. So it is, sometimes people have an E2 and their initial E2 is based on buying a business, and they may have spent $400,000 or $500,000 on the business. But unfortunately, that amount can't count. Their business entity can still be used, but they would have to still invest in another 800,000 or 1,050,000 into that entity, because so it is something to keep in mind. It is one of the fundamental differences between E2 and EB-5.
That could be a very fine distinction, right? Because the purchase price for the business cannot count, but if you're investing in the business and that is applied to the business, that can count as investment.
Exactly. So you can, if the money you give to the seller won't count, but any more money that you put into the business could count.
Right. Okay, so maybe we can also then focus on the scenarios of going from an E2 to an EB-5, because that is a scenario that we do see a lot.
Yeah.
So if you could just go over on a high level, what will be the differences between the E2 and the EB-5, and how would one strategize moving from an E2 to an EB-5?
No, absolutely. So the key differences are, one, the E2 is very particular. Sorry, the EB-5 is very particular with source of funds. So E2, it also has a source of funds requirement, but EB-5 is much more difficult. The other is that E2 doesn't really care where the money came from, in the sense of you can invest through an entity, you can invest, like a friend could give you, that could invest on your behalf, et cetera. There's lots of different options for E2, whether it's through E2 employee, but even through E2 investor, because E2 investor is really looking that you own 50% of the company. The other big difference, we talked about some of the fees that can be included in E2, but not in EB-5. And then, the other difference is that purchasing a business, that's one of the big one of the big differences. The other kind of obvious differences, E2 doesn't have a set investment amount or employee amount, whereas EB-5, as EB-5 does. But we do a lot of transition from people from E2 to EB-5, both people who are just do it through the region center, but then also people who do it through direct investment. And it is definitely very doable, as long as as the biggest obstacle for most is just the investment amount. So
right. So the final question that I have for you today is with regards to the lengthy waiting times involved with EB-5 petitions. So you did mention that the wait time to have an approval just for the initial part could be over 4 years. Is there any way around this? And is there any way to expedite this petition?
Yeah, so one thing that we've definitely found that works really well is suing the U.S. government, and that's filing a mandamus petition. And we've done that successfully in a number of different cases. We just recently had a significant win where someone was waiting over 3 years for their I-526, and in this case, the government actually did try to oppose, and the judge ordered oral argument. Usually, the government will just go and adjudicate the petition. But this time they did try to oppose, and they filed a motion to dismiss. Judge ordered oral argument. We did it, and the judge ruled in our favor. And then we settled with the government, and they said they'll adjudicate the petition within 60 days. So
Wow.
that's we just sued the U.S. government as well. We just filed this last week, where it was an I-829 petition, and the applicant had has been waiting for over 3 years. So definitely, certainly if the wait is under 2 years, it's going to be very difficult to do anything. But we generally say that once someone has hit the 2-year mark, that is a general statement. Once they've hit the 2-year mark, in particular if they're in the U.S., that filing a lawsuit is a good option.
Great. Okay, so I think there is one outstanding question on the question and answer box. Let me take a quick look. Okay, so one of the questions is it able to fast track getting the green card if you'll be providing more jobs than it is required in rural areas, for example? And for that, I think we just answered, yeah, the alternative is suing the government. And sometimes that could be possible, but there is no other fast track option available. Another question. Okay, for these, I would say for fact-specific questions, really the best way to explore these fact patterns would be through a consultation. And we are happy to engage in 30-minute or 1-hour consultations to discuss your case. We will be sending you a link to sign up for the consultation. So please feel free to reach out to us on that matter. All right, so I think that is it for with regards to the questions. Ian, thank you so much for your time. This has been very informative.
Excellent. Thank you.
And everybody, have a good day then.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, bye, everybody. Take care. Bye.